The call was going smoothly. Too smoothly. On the screen in front of me, the Japanese delegation looked relaxed, confident. Especially Mr. Tanaka. He had once called me the spine of your entire digital operation. I nodded as he spoke, catching every detail, quietly noting the last few items we needed to finalize before signing. 11 months. That's how long I'd carried this deal. Through time zone hell, government hurdles, a spring earthquake, and a midsummer security audit, and now it was happening. I smiled, genuinely, almost stupidly, for a moment. I forgot how little trust I had left in the people behind me. Then my screen pinged. I didn't jump, just glanced. One new message. Subject line. Urgent. Role termination notification. I blinked. Mr. Tanaka kept speaking, composed, thoughtful, laying out final terms. I kept nodding like nothing had changed, like there wasn't a sudden ache blooming in my throat. My hand stayed still on the desk, but my pulse slipped out of rhythm. I didn't open the email, not right away. Could have been a mistake, a phishing attempt, some botched HR template, because no one sends real termination notices during a live international client meeting. Right? He finished. I unmuted. We're aligned, I said. My voice didn't shake. We'll move forward with your revisions. I'll send over the paperwork by end of day. I clicked end call. The screen dimmed. The moment evaporated. Then, and only then, I opened the email. 2 lines. From Colin Merrick, COO. Due to structural realignment, your role has been deemed redundant. Please clear your desk by 5 o'clock in the afternoon today. Final compensation will be deposited within 14 business days. No explanation, no signature, just a gentle, sanitized severing of a woman who'd carried the company's infrastructure for almost a decade. I stared at it. No words formed in my head. No reaction, just silence. That heavy, humming kind that comes before something breaks. Redundant. I said it out loud, not angry, not confused, just testing the shape of the word in the air. It didn't even sound real, outside my window. The city was still spinning, cars moving, people walking, glass buildings catching morning light. Everything looked normal, except everything had changed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, hands calm in my lap. The warmth from the laptop fading into cold plastic. Then I stood. Slowly. Took my coat. Reached for the 1922 fountain pen from my grandfather. The photo of my son when he was 5. And the pawn-shaped paperweight that had sat on my desk since the first day I earned the title Chief Architect. I left everything else behind. The awards, the plaques, the legacy they claimed to honor. Because I already knew. They weren't just letting go of me. They were letting go of the only person holding the whole damn system together. I didn't go to my car. Not yet. Instead, I walked past the elevators, down the hallway, and into the women's restroom on the 21st floor, the one nobody ever used because it was half hidden behind the old server closet. The motion sensor lights flickered on with a click. The mirror didn't lie. I looked polished, lipstick still intact, blouse sharp from that morning's steam press, my hair tucked neatly behind one ear. On the outside, I looked like someone who just closed an 8-figure contract, not like someone who'd just been erased from her own infrastructure. I stepped closer, no cracks in the reflection, but something inside had already started to splinter. I didn't cry. There was no point. I didn't scream. That would have felt theatric, instead. I pulled out my phone. My hands moved on their own, calm, practiced. I opened the encrypted folder, buried 5 layers deep behind a row of innocuous travel receipts. The folder was named Sentinel Loop, something no one at Neuralvest knew existed. I tapped once. No confirmation screen. No warning. A progress wheel spun silently. Nothing dramatic. No crashing sounds. Just a quiet instruction slipping through the veins of a system they thought they owned. It was already embedded in every layer of code I'd touched since 2019. A shadow protocol. Invisible unless you knew the pulse pattern. Sentinel Loop wasn't revenge. It was a safeguard. One I'd built not out of bitterness, but out of memory. Because I'd been here before. Not here, but somewhere like it. 12 years ago. I'd raised my voice. It was back at Kestrel Data Solutions, just after a major breach that left half our internal files exposed. Our CTO tried to scapegoat the junior developers for the weak encryption, kids who'd been given impossible deadlines and zero support. I stood up in the Monday town hall, called it what it was. A leadership failure. Said it. Into the mic. With the CTO sitting 6 feet away. I remember my voice shaking. I remember thinking that telling the truth would fix something. It didn't. By Friday, I was reassigned to a satellite office 2 states away. No official demotion, just disappearance. Like I'd embarrassed the system by seeing too much of it. Like truth itself was a liability they couldn't afford to keep around. The memo they sent out called me divisive. Doesn't collaborate well across hierarchy. Translation: she doesn't play dumb when told to. I learned 2 things that week. First, no one saves you when you speak too soon. Second, silence can be the sharpest blade in the room if you know when to use it. That's why I didn't fight when Colin's email landed. That's why I didn't forward it to legal or beg for clarity. And that's why. Right now. As my reflection stared back at me, whole, cold, and completely unreadable, I let Sentinel Loop do what it was designed for, not to scream, to rewire. The last bar on the progress wheel filled, then disappeared. No sound, no pop-up, just a ripple, already moving. I put my phone away, adjusted the collar of my blouse, and wiped a smudge of mascara from under my eye that wasn't even there. Habit. Maybe. Or maybe I just needed to touch something real for a second. Outside, the company was still humming, but underneath, the frequency had changed, and I was the only one who could hear it. I walked back to my office like I hadn't just pulled the pin from a live grenade. Everything looked the same. Same humming lights overhead, same meaningless buzz from the open floor workspace 2 doors down. I could still hear someone arguing about project timelines. Someone else laughing at a meme they thought was clever enough to interrupt actual work. But for me, everything had gone still. When I stepped inside my office, the scent of lemon polish and burnt espresso hit me like muscle memory. I'd spent almost a decade in this room, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, and sometimes more. It was never a throne. It was a bunker, a war room, and, at times, a sanctuary, but never just an office. I closed the door behind me, slowly, quietly. Then I started packing, not in a rush, not like someone scared of being walked out by security. I packed like someone who understood that the ceremony of leaving mattered more than the act itself. First, I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out the 1922 Mont Blanc fountain pen. The black lacquer had faded in places from my grip over the years, but it still wrote like silk on glass. My grandfather used to say, "A pen tells the truth when a mouth can't." Then I opened the second drawer, took out the photo of my son, age 5. He was holding a toy airplane in one hand, half a peanut butter sandwich in the other, with a wide grin that hadn't been touched by disappointment yet. He's stationed overseas now. Thinks his mom works in corporate strategy. I never told him how often that meant being a political bodyguard for men who couldn't build what I did, but wanted credit anyway. The third item I picked up was the stone pawn, a tiny paperweight I found at a second-hand shop years ago. It sat on the corner of my desk since my first promotion. Quiet, sturdy, never flashy, just there, like me. That pawn had seen things, the betrayals, the absurd all-hands meetings, the nights I'd stayed past midnight, rewriting failed deployment schedules with one eye on the burn chart and the other on Slack, waiting for people too junior or too tired to ask for help. I held it in my palm and felt its weight. It was heavier than it looked. Then I looked around. The plaques lined up along the side wall, all 12 of them, each engraved with a year and a title. Excellence in Strategy, Innovation Leadership, Top Integrator. Not one of them came with a pay raise. Not one of them came with respect. They were rewards for being useful, not valued, and I wasn't useful anymore. They said so, in 2 lines. So I left them all, didn't even touch the crystal cube that read, Loyalty Easks Leadership. I used to run my fingers over those words when I felt myself unraveling, back when I still believed they meant something, on my way out. I glanced back at it. It caught the light, refracting it like it always did, like it was trying too hard to look important. And that's when I said it. Quiet enough for only the walls to hear. I was loyal, until you made me obsolete. That was my goodbye. I zipped my bag closed, looped the strap over my shoulder, and took one last breath of the office air before stepping into the corridor. The door clicked shut behind me. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to. They'd change the lock soon enough anyway. As I walked down the hallway, no one stopped me. No one even looked up. The same people who'd asked for help a dozen times this quarter suddenly seemed allergic to eye contact. I wasn't angry at them. Not really. This place taught everyone how to survive. It just forgot how to honor those who built the shelter in the first place. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped in without hesitation, pawn in my palm, system humming behind me, storm just starting to gather. I didn't look back when the elevator doors closed behind me. I kept my eyes on the numbers as they descended, floor by floor, like a countdown. 21, 18, 14. By the time I hit the lobby, something had already shifted. The lights above the reception desk flickered, not enough to draw attention, but enough to catch mine. The lobby screen, which usually played some meaningless loop of stock performance and executive quotes, flashed a blue error bar for half a second before resetting. It had started. I walked through security like I had every other morning, gave a small nod to Thomas at the front desk. He nodded back, oblivious. As I stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, I felt it. Not relief, not satisfaction, just awareness. Like standing on the shoreline before a tsunami you know they don't see coming. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even smug. I was still. That stillness didn't last long. Halfway down the block, I got a text from Lena. Something's up. Floor 12 servers lagging. Dashboard frozen. 1 minute later, a second message. Slack auto-kicked everyone. And, is it weird the espresso machine just shut off? I didn't reply. She didn't need me to. Because she knew. I kept walking. The wind picked up behind me. I couldn't tell if it was real or just the way tension moves when the center starts to shift. Back inside Neuralvest. The technical floor was descending into quiet chaos. Screens froze. Dashboards blinked out. API links failed to load. At first, they thought it was a bandwidth issue. Then someone tried rebooting the analytics server on floor 12, and the control panel returned nothing but a blinking red slash. Drive wouldn't load. Jira returned blank. SAP refused logins. Even the machine in the executive lounge, the $12,000 automated espresso bar Colin insisted on importing from Italy, shut down mid-foam. And still, no alarms, just flickers, glitches, a slow, silent suffocation. They didn't even know they were choking yet, until Colin stormed into what had been my office. He wasn't even subtle. I heard from Lena later that his loafers actually squeaked on the tile as he ran. Red in the face, tie askew, holding his phone like it might bite him. I'd barely made it to the next block when I got the call. I didn't answer, but I imagined it perfectly. He burst into the empty room, expecting to find me there. maybe waiting for an explanation, maybe for an apology. What he found instead was an empty chair, an open drawer, and the absence of control. Lena told me he stood there for a full 10 seconds, stunned, before turning to her in the hallway and barking, "What the hell did she do?" She didn't answer. She just stepped aside. He stomped back out, shouting about backups, demanding logs, trying to find someone, anyone, to blame. And I wasn't there to see it. But I wish I had been. Because if I were, I would have reached into my pocket, pulled out the tiny stone pawn still warm in my hand, and said it to his face. "You removed a pawn. Pity it was the one holding your board together." Instead, I just slipped the pawn back into my pocket, took a deep breath, and smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted silence. And he had filled the last few years with nothing but noise. The system wasn't crashing, not yet. It was reconfiguring, cell by cell, nerve by nerve. They didn't know it, but every button they pushed now was connected to me, not directly, not traceably, but intimately. Their infrastructure was no longer theirs. It was mine, and it had only just begun to flicker. I didn't go far. After 2 blocks, I slowed down. There was a small plaza tucked behind an old courthouse building. Nothing fancy. A few benches. Some planters that hadn't been watered properly in weeks. It was quiet, tucked away from the traffic and the panic that was surely beginning to pulse inside Neural Vest, like a fever breaking through the skin. I sat down under a crooked shade tree and let the silence wrap around me. My phone buzzed. Lena. Not a text, not a call, just a notification. Shared folder activity. Mirror Watch Sync initialized. That wasn't part of her job, not technically, but she knew where to look. And more importantly, she knew when to look. I didn't smile, but I exhaled. 2 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate, careful. I didn't turn. She sat next to me. No words, just her presence, solid, grounded. She clutched her tablet close to her chest like a shield, still wearing her ID badge, still in the Neural Vest dress code, neutral blouse, flat shoes. Hair pulled back just enough to say, "I'm efficient," but not enough to say, "I'm ambitious." It was a survival balance. I'd taught her that. Lena had only been my assistant on paper. She handled scheduling. Yes. Arranged travel. Sure. But that wasn't what earned her my attention. It was what she did after hours. Every time a system audit ended, she stayed late, not to gossip, not to polish brass, but to ask questions, real ones, like, why do we mirror critical analytics twice, but only segment security logs once? Or, what would happen if the CRM backend tried to handshake with an incomplete IP string? That wasn't admin curiosity. That was architect thinking. And over time, I started leaving trails for her. Little ones. A second login token here. A sandbox file there. If she caught them and used them right. I gave her the next piece. No explanation. No mentoring speech. Just quiet access. She never misused it. Now, sitting here with me, she said nothing, but her eyes met mine. And that was enough. Because in that single glance, I knew she didn't know everything. I had never told her about Sentinel Loop, about the full Raven Wake protocol, or the deeper redundancies I'd buried in dormant shell nodes across our legacy framework. But she knew enough. She knew the system was changing, by design. She knew it wasn't a glitch, and she knew who had started the unraveling. I finally turned to her. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded once. "They pulled the fire drill alarm. It thinks it's a server misalignment." Of course they did. I looked down at her tablet. The screen glowed with the admin dashboard I'd trained her to find, but never directly told her existed. "You accessed Mirror Watch?" I asked. She didn't flinch. "Just to monitor, not to trigger." "Good girl." I leaned back against the bench and closed my eyes for half a second, just breathing. The air was warmer than it had any right to be. Late summer always lingered like an overstayed guest. "Do you need me to do anything else?" she asked, voice calm, low. I opened my eyes and looked at her again. Her grip on the tablet had loosened, not from fear, from readiness. "You already have," I said. She nodded slowly. No victory in her expression, no adrenaline, just understanding, just presence. And that was the difference between Lena and everyone else still scrambling inside that building. They followed orders. She followed the current, before she stood. She slipped a thumb drive into the side pocket of my bag. "Fail-safe mirror," she said. I didn't ask when she built it. She didn't ask what would happen next, as she walked away. I watched her disappear into the street crowd, just another efficient assistant in flats and a badge. Invisible to most, but not to me. Because that's the thing about apprentices. The good ones don't need direction, they need trust. And I had given her mine, quietly, entirely, without regret. I hadn't sat on this bench in almost 6 years. It was still here, tilted slightly. A hairline crack in the middle plank. The paint long since peeled to the bone. One end leaned toward the edge of the riverwalk. The other pressed against a dying maple tree that hadn't turned fully green in 3 seasons. The view was nothing special. Just water with some broken concrete pilings sticking out like fractured teeth from the old industrial pier. A bridge in the distance. Faint sound of city buses. Seagulls somewhere, half-hearted. But this was the bench I came to after that day. The day they demoted me for strategic realignment the first time. Different company, different man in the suit. Same brand of cowardice. I remember sitting here in a fog of numbness. The taste of shame so thick in my mouth I couldn't swallow. I didn't eat for 2 days. Just sat and watched the river pretend it wasn't full of rust. Something about the honesty of it, the way it didn't care if it looked clean or graceful, made me feel less alone. That bench didn't save me, but it didn't abandon me, either. So I came back. And this time, I wasn't broken. I was building. I leaned back and closed my eyes, felt the weight of the pawn still in my pocket. I hadn't let go of it since I walked out. Not because I needed a symbol, but because some part of me had already made the decision. If this was the end of one system, it would also be the blueprint for another. My phone buzzed. Blocked number. I stared at the screen for a second, then answered without speaking. There was a pause, exactly 4 seconds long. Then a voice, German accented, female, precise. "Protocol activated?" I took a breath. Not deep, just deliberate. "Yes," I said. Contained, but not gentle. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Are you visible?" "Not yet." "Are you traceable?" "Only if I want to be." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. I hadn't heard that voice in nearly a decade. We worked together during an incident in 2016, one involving a government firewall breach that was never publicly disclosed. We weren't allies. We weren't friends. We were mutually beneficial ghosts. "See, if they escalate," she said, "you'll need to consider extraction." I looked out over the water. The wind was starting to pick up, bringing the scent of algae and steel. "They already escalated," I said. "They just don't know it yet." She hesitated. "You understand what's at stake if they push this into arbitration?" "They won't." "How can you be sure?" I closed my eyes again. The sound of the wind in the trees above me had shifted. It wasn't a breeze anymore. It was something heavier, more like breath. "Because they think they're chasing an employee," I said. "Not an architect." She let that settle. Then, for the first time in our history, she softened. "Do you have a new name?" "Umbra." A pause. Then the sound of paper, like she was noting it down. "If they come to us, we won't confirm." "You never have." And that was it. No goodbye. Just the call ending with the silence of two people who understood the rules too well to pretend anything more needed to be said. I slid the phone back into my coat pocket and leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring down at the cracks in the walkway. A beetle crawled between two blades of grass, pushing through the concrete. It moved like it had somewhere to be. I reached into my bag, pulled out Lena's thumb drive, and rolled it between my fingers. Smooth edges, no label, just a clean slate full of mirrored protocols, fallback triggers, and one executable file named Cinderlock. I hadn't opened it yet. Not even I knew what she'd built into it. But I trusted her, and that was the shift. This wasn't just my revenge anymore. It wasn't even just about Neural Vest. It was bigger, more systemic, a quiet revolution, wrapped in code and misdirection, passed from woman to woman like a whisper in the dark, a leak-proof transition, a firewall made of trust, a kingdom no one saw being built because we weren't using bricks. We were using shadows. As I stood, the sun dipped lower behind the clouds. A chill crept in, not from fear, but anticipation. The ripple had begun, and I was done sitting still. It didn't start with anger. It started with observation. 4 years ago, I saw the first signal, small, easily missable, a change in the reporting structure, not announced, not explained, just executed. I was pulled out of decision flow on 2 core projects. Without consultation, Colin, freshly promoted to COO, told me it was just streamlining. I let it go. 2 months later, my budget got slashed by 12%. No warning, no metrics. The finance team dodged my emails until I cornered someone in a stairwell and asked if this was a mistake. He stammered something about resource reallocation. I didn't argue. I watched. Then came the replacements. People with smiles too big for their experience levels. One was a former consultant Colin had worked with on a failed blockchain venture. Another came from a tech incubator that burned through 3 CEOs in a single year. Neither had infrastructure background, but both had the same trait. They obeyed. It became obvious then. Colin wasn't trying to modernize. He was trying to displace, not just me, my legacy. So I did what he never thought I would. I started building under him. Sentinel Loop began as a whisper, a single thread of code that duplicated our network performance dashboards, just for diagnostics. I told myself, just to understand how deep the cuts were going, but code doesn't stay still. It grows. It adapts. So did I. By the second quarter of that year, I had mirrored 3 of our core systems: analytics, inventory routing, and internal comms. Not exact copies. Smart copies. Ones that learned usage patterns. Ones that could run on skeleton code, independent of primary command structures. But that wasn't enough, because if I ever needed to pull the trigger, I couldn't afford to do it all at once. A total swap would set off alerts, internal checks, red flags. I needed something more surgical, something subtle. That's when I developed the heartbeat, a timed micro-update, embedded inside each cloned module. Each beat mimicked a legitimate system patch, staggered weeks apart, randomized, nearly invisible, but every time the beat executed, it nudged the Sentinel version 1 layer higher, while pushing the original framework 1 layer down. Think of it like shifting tiles in a mosaic, one piece at a time. No one notices until the image changes. By the end of year 2, 40% of Neural Vest's operational backbone was already running on Sentinel Loop. And no one knew. Not Colin, not IT, not even Lena, though she'd later prove she didn't need to know the what to trust the why. The trick wasn't in the code, it was in the rhythm. I'd engineered a silent takeover, one that didn't announce itself until it was too late to stop. And I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I'd seen how systems die, not through one massive failure, but through erosion, paper cuts, budget cuts, cultural decay disguised as evolution. Colin didn't know how to build, but I did. And I wasn't about to let a decade of work get overwritten by someone who thought leadership was just a louder microphone. I remember the exact night I finished the final piece. It was past 2 a.m. Everyone else had gone home. The office was quiet except for the occasional hum of the HVAC. I sat in the war room alone, one hand on the console, the other nursing a cup of coffee I'd microwaved 3 times. The last segment to install was the recursive shell on the user authentication tree, a fail-safe that would allow me to decouple Sentinel from Neural Vest entirely. Should I ever need to? A clean break, no residuals, no digital fingerprint. As I typed in the final line, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief. Control. Not the kind that wants attention. The kind that prepares. A skeleton key isn't loud. It doesn't bang on doors. It just fits where nothing else can. That's what Sentinel Loop was, my key. My quiet resistance. So when the layoffs started picking up again last year, when the whispers about sunsetting legacy roles started circling HR like vultures around a spreadsheet, I didn't panic. I just adjusted the beat timing by 0.3%. The system finished replacing itself last month. And now, they weren't running my infrastructure. They were standing on it, without even knowing the floor had shifted beneath their feet. It happened the way all real betrayals do, quietly, inside a folder no one was supposed to see. I hadn't been looking for it. I was just combing through the data residue of the procurement freeze that had triggered last week's server confusion. A shell script had misfired on one of the mirrored instances of our HR budget tool. And in the cleanup logs, I noticed an access pattern that didn't belong. A hidden folder, titled something sterile. Strategic Succession Planning, Phase 3. It was tucked inside a compliance backup no one had touched in over 6 months. Not labeled as confidential, not encrypted, just buried. Like someone assumed it would never be found by anyone with a brain. That was their first mistake. I opened the PDF. The header said it all. Sunsetting Initiative, Phase 3, Implementation Brief. My stomach dropped before I even read the first bullet. The entire document was a roadmap, not for growth, not for restructuring, but for removal. A coordinated strategy for quietly phasing out senior leadership deemed non-scalable. And by non-scalable, they meant women. Specifically, women over the age of 45. I scrolled. There were graphs. God! They used graphs, breaking down attrition targets by quarter. Names weren't listed, but roles were, and I recognized every single one. Heads of risk, compliance, architecture, data policy, all women, all long-tenured, all highly compensated, all disposable. Apparently, I didn't breathe until page 6. That's where it was. A note in the margin. Informal. Probably never meant to be seen outside the inner circle. They're candles from a past era, it read. Let's blow them out while the lights are still on. At the bottom, CM, Colin Merrick. I didn't scream, didn't smash the keyboard or punch the desk. I just sat there, jaw locked, pulse in my throat. I'd known. Of course, not the scope, not the strategy, but the intention. The signs had been there for years. Quiet cuts, reassigned projects, promotions bypassed in favor of shinier, hungrier men with slicker hair and thinner resumes. But seeing it this clearly, this coldly laid out, it wasn't just personal anymore. It was generational. And the language, sunsetting. As if our knowledge had an expiration date. As if experience itself was now a liability. They'd wrapped misogyny in a vocabulary of innovation and thought we wouldn't notice. But I noticed, and I would remember. I downloaded the file, encrypted it with a SHA-256 layer, and packed it inside a stealth backup node hosted out of Estonia. One of the dead startup servers I'd quietly purchased in 2018, back when I still believed in redundancy as a virtue. Not a weapon. Once it uploaded, I deleted all local traces, the original log access, the cache, even the link trail that led me there. But I didn't delete the feeling. That stayed. Because I knew now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't politics or misaligned KPIs or poor communication. This was a purge, strategic, deliberate, systemic. And I wasn't the only target, just the first to be cleanly removed. Colin wasn't just coming for me. He was coming for all of us, the women who had built the digital spine of this company, who had protected it through acquisitions, bad leadership cycles, and platform collapses. The ones who didn't brag, didn't posture. We just worked. And apparently, that made us expendable. I thought about Renee in compliance, about Lila in data ops, about the quiet email I'd received 3 months ago from Marta in vendor relations, asking if I'd heard any rumors about a shift. At the time, I hadn't known how to answer. Now, I did. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The tiles were the same standard drop-in units used in every corporate building since the 90s, probably hadn't been cleaned in years. Above them ran a network of ducts, sensors, and cables, dozens of systems, quietly humming, keeping the building alive. Most people never looked up. Most people never thought to ask what was above them, around them, underneath them. That was Colin's second mistake, because while he was busy sunsetting voices, I was building new frequencies, louder, sharper, undefinable, and I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I sat in the corner booth of a hotel lounge 5 blocks from Neuralvest's headquarters. Same table I used during quarterly audits, back when I still believed meetings were the way to solve problems. My laptop was open, angled just enough to be discreet. A soft instrumental soundtrack played over the speakers, barely masking the rising voices of a panicked finance team 2 tables over. They didn't work for us. Just a coincidence. But their anxiety felt like a fitting backdrop. On my screen was a live diagnostic panel, not Neuralvest's. Mine. Sentinel Loop was running at 92% capacity. The heartbeat pulses I'd set in motion 4 years ago were now orchestrating a masterpiece of misdirection. Earlier that morning, Colin must have realized his infrastructure was misfiring. That's when the real fun began. I watched as the internal IT team initiated a cascade reboot. To them, everything looked normal. All the lights turned green. The analytics module pinged positive. API relays responded on schedule. Drive mounts remounted. Slack even chimed twice, like it had just remembered how to exist. Except none of it was real, because what they were rebooting wasn't the system. It was the copy. Sentinel Loop didn't just replace their tools, it replaced their perception of function. Every status bar was simulated. Every success ping was a decoy, a beautifully crafted mirage I'd spent years perfecting. They thought they were recovering, but what they were actually doing was plugging themselves deeper into a sandbox, an enclosed mirror that looked, felt, and even responded like the original framework. Only difference? Everything they touched now was feeding them garbage, and I watched it happen in real time. The first hiccup came 20 minutes into their recovery. A junior systems engineer, Thomas, I think, flagged a delay in the CRM load. He rebooted it manually. The dashboard came up, clean, fast, fully integrated. Everything showed green. That's when I leaned forward, because I knew something he didn't. The data layer underneath had already been gutted. There were no live records, no active contracts, no invoice chains, just rows of placeholder text and dummy values I'd seeded months ago. Client 001, archived under legacy ping records. Invoice PDF field, null across all parameters. It looked full. It was empty. He clicked into the customer pipeline. The page loaded smoothly. Too smoothly. That's when he hesitated. Because even he could tell. Something felt off. The sales cycle dates didn't align. The contract stages were outdated. The timestamps showed activity, but the audit logs showed silence. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head, and the panic rising just behind his eyes. I refreshed my feed. On my end. The echo wall lit up, dozens of cloned queries bouncing back dead data, designed to simulate noise, but never output signal. They weren't fixing the system. They were dancing with its ghost. And Colin? He was still holding meetings, still drafting press statements, still telling the board it was a temporary disruption. I knew because I'd intercepted his internal comms loop. Even that had been routed through Sentinel since last quarter. He had no idea. He was so sure he'd buried me under a label, redundant, that he never once questioned whether the bones of the machine he inherited still belonged to me. And now, he was feeding those bones coffee and aspirin, thinking it would fix a fracture. I closed the laptop slowly, savoring the silence between status updates. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was a lesson. In arrogance, in ignorance, in the dangers of assuming the person you erased didn't leave traps behind. I paid my tab, stood up, slipped the pawn from my pocket, and tapped it once on the marble tabletop before sliding it back. Because while they were hunting a problem, I'd already become the solution they could never control. It came at 8:01 in the evening, almost to the second. I was back in my apartment, lights dimmed, shoes off, glass of still water beside me. The pawn sat on the coffee table. Next to my laptop, I wasn't even working, just watching the last traces of the system choke on its own illusion. Then came the encrypted ping, a string of kanji in the subject line. Sender, the secondary relay address we'd used during the 2021 typhoon disruptions in Japan. When all other channels had failed, inside was a single sentence, stripped of pleasantries or qualifiers. System handshake broken. Still interested in collaboration? No logo, no formatting, just precision. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Still for a moment. This wasn't just a contract renewal. This was an invitation, an acknowledgement that they knew, not suspected, knew, who had held the system together all along, that it wasn't the company, or the logo, or the chain of command. It was me, my architecture, my ethics, my obsessive drive for resiliency at the cost of recognition. And now that the mask had slipped off Neuralvest's servers, the client wasn't hesitating. They were moving. I took one breath, and then typed a single word in reply. Interested? 4 minutes later, another encrypted file arrived, this one with a PDF attachment labeled, Letter of Intent, Umbra Systems. They already had the name. I smiled, not out of vanity, but out of something quieter, arrival. Umbra Systems had been legally registered 6 months ago in Delaware, under an anonymous holding structure, complete with intellectual property transfer clauses, encrypted client onboarding terms, and a discretionary contractor model that required zero physical office space. Everything had been built. Slowly, quietly, brick by invisible brick. I opened the PDF. They weren't asking for a bridge deal. They were offering a full migration, 24-month infrastructure contract, with quarterly performance gates and full autonomy on system architecture. My architecture. No middleman, no branding games, no legacy protocols. I scrolled to the bottom and saw it. Designated signatory, Avery Lane, CTO, Umbra Systems, LLC. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for clarification. I signed digitally, cleanly, legally, and in that moment. I wasn't a former employee anymore. I was an independent entity. The kind of freedom most people never experience because they're too scared to step outside the safety net of nameplates and org charts. But I had already fallen, and now, I was learning how to fly. I hit send. Within seconds, a confirmation came back. A second ping followed it, this time. A simple note from Tanaka himself. We never relied on Neuralvest. We relied on you. 7 words. That was all. But they hit like a bell in a cathedral. Not loud, just precise, reverberating through everything I'd doubted for too long. I leaned back, letting the glow of the screen light my face. I wasn't shaking, but my pulse had that edge. It always did before major deployment nights. Except this wasn't deployment. It was liberation. I thought about the others. Renee, Marta, Leela, the ones still caught inside Neural Vest's crumbling walls, unaware that escape was possible. That outside the system. There were clients, contracts, whole futures that didn't require permission. I thought about Lena, her thumb drive, her silence, her certainty. This was never about revenge. It was about reclamation. The moment they cut me loose, they disconnected themselves from the very foundation they pretended to control. They thought I was redundant. But redundancy, by definition, only applies when you have a second copy. They didn't. Now I was no longer holding up their world. I was building my own. The call came in at 10:23 in the evening. Unlisted number. But I knew the cadence. I told Lena to use a rolling VoIP line for anything after hours. Always routed through a double mask node in Chicago. I answered without speaking. Her voice came through. Calm and crisp like always, but laced with something new. Satisfaction. Maybe. Or awe. He's locked himself in the IT vault. I didn't respond. I waited. Screaming, she added. Says you've hijacked the company's soul. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. It felt earned. Colin had finally realized what was happening, but not why, to him. This was still sabotage. A rogue ex-employee pulling strings out of spite. He hadn't yet grasped the truth. This wasn't emotional. It was surgical. They're drafting emergency arbitration, Lena continued. Legal can't even access the contract template servers. Of course they couldn't. The templates had been quietly rerouted last quarter, redirected to mirrored paths that looped into dead indexes with recursive decay cycles. They'd open the files. Sure, but they'd never save them, never export, never restore, because the old world was no longer theirs to manage. It was mine. Initiate phase 2, I said, voice even. There was a pause on the line, a breath. You sure? Execute. Lena didn't argue. She never did. That was what made her lethal. I opened my laptop, logged into the backup node I'd reserved for this very moment. One last folder, locked, encrypted, air-gapped from every other piece of Sentinel Loop, a project so deeply buried. Not even Lena had full access to it until now. I opened the file named Raven Wake, a final script, designed not to disrupt, designed to erase. My cursor hovered for half a second, then clicked. The terminal opened. No fireworks, no explosion, just a simple string of commands executing in clean sequence. Line after line rolled by, purging meta tags, scrubbing access registries, unbinding commit authorship, overwriting internal node identity, lane, A. It was working. Every trace of me, my name, my fingerprints, my timestamps, was vanishing from the source history, from the system commit logs, from the digital plaque outside the innovation lab that once bore my name. I watched it flicker on the mirrored feed. Avery Lane, chief architect, flicker, stutter, reset, unattributed build, origin unknown. Perfect, because I wasn't building a legacy. I was eliminating a threat. As long as my name lived inside their system, they could use it, drag it into courtrooms, into boardrooms, into press cycles designed to frame me as the architect of chaos. They could twist my code into something ugly, something political. They could rewrite the story, but not if I disappeared first. I heard Lena breathe again, this time slower. It's done, she said. She didn't need to ask how I felt, because I didn't feel, not in the way most people would. This wasn't grief. It wasn't triumph. It was something colder, sharper. The clarity that comes when you finally burn the last bridge and realize you never needed it to begin with. I closed the terminal, ejected the drive, wiped the RAM, on the screen. The Sentinel Loop dashboard was clean, functional, authorship scrubbed, dependencies severed, the final detachment complete. I was no longer part of NeuralVest's ecosystem, not digitally, not structurally, not legally, to them. I was just gone. And in that erasure, I'd found something even more powerful than vengeance, freedom, outside. The city lights buzzed against the windows of my new workspace, quiet, rented, temporary, but the infrastructure was mine. The clients were mine. The rules, mine. Colin could scream in his vault all night long, but no one was coming to save him, because the architect was never the villain. She was the system, and now, she'd rewritten herself out of their story, so she could finally start writing her own. It was 3:14 in the morning when my phone lit up. I wasn't asleep. I hadn't really slept in days, not out of stress, but momentum, like my mind couldn't come down yet. Not when the engine had just cooled. The screen glowed with a familiar name. Eli, Base calling my son. I tapped accept. His face appeared, slightly pixelated from a low bandwidth signal, but still unmistakable. Same sharp eyes, same raised brow he got from me. His buzz cut was a little uneven, probably rushed. Behind him, a bunk and the soft green glow of night status lights. He looked at me for a moment, then smirked. "Mom, you're trending again." I laughed. It was quiet, but real. "Am I finally cool?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nah, just terrifying." We talked for a while. About nothing. About everything. About his unit. His new CO. My new place. He'd seen the listing. Said it looked serious. It was a brownstone tucked behind the university district, clean lines, tall windows, and a rooftop balcony that caught the sunrise if you were willing to wait long enough. He asked if I was happy. I paused. Not out of hesitation, just to feel it. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'm not angry anymore." He nodded like he understood. I think he did, when the call ended. I sat with the silence for a while. The peaceful kind. Not the kind that follows destruction. The kind that follows completion. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lena, no text, just a photo. It took a second to load. The image showed a familiar hallway, NeuralVest's executive floor, carpet stained, walls stripped, and there on the ground, a broken brass nameplate, split clean through the middle. Colin Merrick, Co-O cracked at the R. Che, next to it. A half-full coffee cup tipped on its side, the last of its contents soaking into the edge of the carpet like a quiet surrender. That was the twist, not the plate, the placement. He didn't wait for a cleaner, he knew it was over. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. I walked to the balcony and slid open the glass door. The wind rolled in off the city like breath, not loud, not fast, just constant. The skyline blinked with warning lights and glass towers still pretending to matter. Below, the world churned. Boardrooms in crisis, lawsuits filed by early morning, clients fleeing, Colin likely on a plane to nowhere, clutching a half-formed PR statement and a duffel bag full of deniability. NeuralVest wouldn't collapse in one day, but it was already hollow, and hollowness spreads. Meanwhile, Umbra Systems had just onboarded its 5th client, 3 of them from NeuralVest's own pipeline. No advertising, no hiring push, just a quiet series of yeses. I hadn't reached out to any of them. They came to me, because when the storm finally broke, they didn't follow the brand. They followed the woman who had built the foundation in silence. I stood at the edge of the balcony and looked out over the city. No headlines, no speeches, no victory dance, just me. The woman they called redundant, the pawn they overlooked, the system they never understood. And now I wasn't just part of the board. I was the board, lying low, moving quiet, holding the final line without ever raising my voice. They tried to delete me, but you can't delete what was never fully visible to begin with. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I simply breathed, loud enough to know I was alive, soft enough that no one could hear the storm returning underneath. Because I wasn't the victim. I wasn't even the revenge. I was the rewrite, lying still like water, deep like code, and strong like a storm no one sees coming, until it's already taken everything.